And in places like the United States and in France in particular has the largest nuclear facilities in Europe, the weapons industry and the nuclear weapons industry and the nuclear power industry are intricately linked. The funding for one funds the other. Macron recently even boasted about this fact that you can't have one without the other, that the nuclear power of France supports the nuclear, you know, weapons of France. And it's the same in the United States. And it goes all the way down to the fuel fabrication for nuclear bombs comes out of, nuclear power reactors. So at a scientific level, they're connected. At a financial level, they're connected when it comes to the major nuclear powers in this country or in the world. So there's a lot of links there, and there has been historically, and there will be continued to be in the future. Which I think it's really interesting when you talk, especially people on the left, that they'll easily dismiss all the problems with nuclear power, and they say, oh well, don't worry about it, it's not a problem. Well, I don't think that any of them ought to ignore that if you actually oppose nuclear weapons, then you have to uh, as a result also oppose nuclear power. You can't have one without the other. It'd be sort of like opposing the Pentagon but supporting the war on terror or whatever. It's like you can't have one without the other, and that's the case with nuclear power and nuclear weapons at a atomic level, and then also at a government level.
But they say, Josh, they say, oh, it's completely different science. It's completely different sets of engineers. It's completely different problems, completely different A, B, C, and D, right? They will work very hard to convince people that you can be supportive of nuclear energy without supporting nuclear weapons by saying the technology is completely different. So, Josh, how are they wrong?
They're wrong because in reality, that's just not how it works. It's never worked that way, and it doesn't work that way now. Nuclear proliferation has been largely dependent on the nuclear power industries and tax dollars that go into that. From like I said, from the technological side of things to the financial side of things, and also I think it's really important to understand that nuclear power produces things like plutonium. Plutonium is a fuel for atomic weaponry. So it will always be controlled by the government because the byproducts of nuclear power can be used in nuclear weapons. So they have to have that tightly guarded so that other governments don't get a hold of it, or terrorist organizations or what have you. So the government will always be involved in the nuclear power industry, and there's just no way around it.
But the argument I hear most often is, well, of course the government is going to be involved in it, and that's why we need to democratize nuclear power. We need to have democratically organized governance over nuclear power and the generation of nuclear power. And if only we could democratize nuclear power, that would solve all the problems.
Well, I would argue that if we democratize the coal industry, it's not going to reduce all of the problems with coal either. It's a silly argument ultimately, and really what it gets down to. I mean, I think I've laid out. I actually have written a piece about the case against nuclear power, and I think there's a number of reasons why people ought to oppose nuclear power. For me personally, um, it has to do with the waste. Nuclear power produces waste that will last up to 250,000 years. What are you going to do with that waste? How are you going to keep that waste safe? A lot of the proponents say, oh, well, these new smaller reactors won't produce as much waste. Well, they still will produce a lot of waste. And if we're ever to have as many nuclear plants as we would be required, it's going to produce a heck of a lot more waste than we produce now, which we still don't know what to do with. Um, and are you gonna bury this stuff? You're gonna keep it safe? How are you gonna keep it secure so other governments don't get a hold of it, or terrorist organizations? How are you going to keep these plants safe? How are you going to ensure that that they aren't ever going to come under attack? I mean, we've seen what's going on in Ukraine, and what kind of risk that poses. This nuclear waste at a place like Hanford, for example, constantly has to be cooled. If the electricity goes down, and to somehow these tanks can't continue to be cool, you're going to have, you're going to have a horrible reaction. There's so many problems with the waste that just there's no fix for it. It is a byproduct. It is you Similarly, you can't burn fossil fuels without having carbon emissions. You can't produce nuclear power without having all this nuclear waste. And I think that's really important for people to understand. And I think it's also really important to understand that this stuff lasts a very, very, very long time. I mean, it just put in perspective, humans have really only been roaming the earth for what, like 50, 60,000 years. What do we can't keep waste at Hanford safe for 100 years. What are we going to do for 1,000 years, let alone 250,000? So, these are really big problems that the boosters really don't have an answer for.
All throughout this summer, we saw rather jarring images of rivers in Europe, rivers in China, rivers and lakes and reservoirs in the United States going dry, water levels dropping by tens, dozens, hundreds of feet in certain situations. And it it's almost laughable when you see all of those images and then you hear people arguing in favor of expansion of nuclear power just for the water use alone. The amount of water required to cool these reactors is astronomical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look at France last summer during Europe's crazy heat wave. Most of the nuclear power plants in France went offline because the rivers were too hot to cool the reactors. So they had to take the reactors offline, which meant they lost that electricity. So, there also, that means that the nuclear power is not reliable. It can't survive in this kind of environment. And of course, as we know with climate change, uh, rivers are going to continue to heat up. And in some cases, you're going to have rivers that no longer exist. So nuclear power is going to be obsolete. You can't have a nuclear power plant without having access to, really cold, ample water supplies. And I think just last summer is a perfect example that, um, you know, it's not a reliable source of energy.
Now, one of the other things that always comes to mind when talking about these issues, and you and I have talked about them a lot of times, but I think for some people, they might not think through all of the implications because you hear like, oh, everybody wants, luxury space communism or whatever, limitless resources, limitless development, in all walks of life. We'll never want for anything ever again. And then you actually look at the real costs of all of this. For instance, strip mining indigenous lands to extract these rare earth minerals and nuclear energy, nuclear minerals that are then used for enrichment, etc. So, can you talk a little bit about the indigenous effects here and what, in particular, indigenous lands have to deal with when it comes to nuclear energy?
Well, in the United States, the Navajo, the Dene, their lands have been the target for uranium mining in this country. And then I think it's also important that most of the sites that have been proposed, Yucca Mountain in particular, is sacred ground as well. And that's been proposed as a nuclear dumping site. So in this country, nuclear proliferation has impacted indigenous communities more than any other. There's no question about that, from the mining to the waste. And there's been a lot of, some of the best activism is happening at that grassroots level. And I think it's really important for people on the left to understand that you can't have nuclear power without uranium. You cannot produce power without uranium. Even the reactors that they don't call uranium reactors still need uranium to produce nuclear energy. And that uranium comes from mining operations. Those mining operations are some of the most toxic, deadly mining operations in the world. There's, at there's the ore that is mined that has uranium has to be extracted. That extraction process, in particular, requires a lot of energy to extract that uranium. Where does that energy come from? Fossil fuels. So the other thing we hear a lot from the pro nuclear crowd is that, oh well, look, it's nuclear power doesn't have CO2 emissions, so it's a godsend, right? Well, actually, no. You have to look at the entire life cycle of these plants from the construction onward, and most of that carbon emissions that come with nuclear power comes at the mining levels. And there are quite a few scientists that when they look at this entire, life of nuclear plants, say, actually, surprisingly for some, perhaps, nuclear power produces more carbon than natural gas. Of course, natural gas also produces methane, and natural gas is horrible. But I think that's interesting, to look at, because one of the biggest things they throw at us is that they're carbon free. Well, they're not. They require a lot of energy at the mining level, and that's before you even get into digging trenches and burrowing holes so you can store your waste in the future. I mean, that's like not even accounted for. So yeah, and again, going back, this happens on indigenous lands, and in the U.S. it happens on Dene lands in particular, because that's where most of the uranium is, in this country.
And we bring it up to make the point that when people try to present nuclear power as a path towards a more egalitarian, maybe not utopian, but more egalitarian, more just, economically just society, we have to keep in mind that it at the same time is replicating all of the same cycles of oppression, dispossession, pollution, destruction of native lands, destruction of sacred lands, etc. All of those things that we read about in the history books, that is part of our shameful history, that is being reproduced in service to economic development and energy needs.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not going to sit here and say that solar doesn't have problems. It certainly has problems. Um, from the mining to building huge solar farms, which I oppose. But none of that is anywhere near the problems that come from nuclear power. None of them. And so I think we need to have an honest discussion about that and try to reduce those risks. I think the other thing that's really important to understand is I think that the left and environmentalists need to call for a decentralizing the grid. We can't rely on these big producers to you know allow have huge solar farms or a nuclear plant. We need to be putting solar on rooftops. We need to decentralize the grid. We need to give power back to the people. I absolutely support that. Um, and there's, in a place like California where I live, the PG&E really fights this, right? SoCal Edison really fights this. They don't want power to be sold and operated at the community level. They would rather, hold the keys to that. And as we've seen, how many forest fires were caused because of down lines that PG&E can't maintain. That solar on rooftops doesn't cause the same kind of problems. And nuclear obviously doesn't answer that as either. You can't really truly decentralized nuclear power. You're not going to have no one's in their right mind would allow small nuclear reactors to be on every street in their town. It just isn't going to happen.
One aspect of Counterpunch that I always have valued, even since long before I was a contributor to Counterpunch, is the fact that it really has an eye towards the tradition and legacy of left activism. And I really believe that the anti-nuke movement, particularly in the 1970s and the early 1980s, that the anti-nuke movement, yeah, the dog agrees. You see what I'm saying? The dog agrees that the anti-nuke movement really was in some ways the most successful mass movement that the left has produced in the post-war period. I mean, along with civil rights, I suppose, and the anti-war movement in the Vietnam period. I mean, the anti-nuclear movement is in many ways one of the high watermarks for the left in that period. And to find us coming full circle in this way, to where people on the left are genuinely questioning whether anti-nuke voices are just insane tree-hugging hippies or something. Can you talk a little bit about the legacy of the anti-nuke movement and the importance